Khushwant Singh was born in Hardali, Punjab, which is now in Pakistan. A celebrated author, journalist, novelist, lawyer and politician, Khushwant Singh donned many hats in his long and illustrious career. He served as a Member of Parliament for 6 years. Among other honours, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan and Padma Vibhushan. Many of Singh's major works draw inspiration from his own life. He presents a simple but true picture of Indian social, cultural and political realities. His notable works include Train to Pakistan, Delhi a Novel and A History of the Sikhs. The Portrait of a Lady is an autobiographical account of Khushwant Singh's grandmother, highlighting the emotional bond they shared with each other. The author travels down memory lane and recollects fond memories associated with her. The story explores the effect of time and circumstances on the relationship between Singh and his grandmother. Through their relationship, it comments on the lives of the elderly and their need for companionship and friendship. Here is a summary of The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. The author remembers his grandmother as an old lady like anyone's grandmother. He believes her to be eternally old and finds it extremely hard to accept that she was once young or that she played games as a child. As far back as his memories went, she was fat, short, and had wrinkles all over her face. She walked around the house with a slight stoop, praying soundlessly with a rosary in her hand. She always wore white and was as peaceful and bright as snow-covered mountains in winter. The author declares that though his grandmother was never pretty, she was definitely beautiful. As a child, the author lived with his grandmother in their village while his parents lived in the city. His grandmother used to dress him up, give him breakfast and also drop him to the village school every day. While he learnt the alphabet in his class, she read scriptures in the temple attached to his school. After school, they walked back home together, feeding the village dogs. Things, however, began to change when the author's parents brought them to live in the city. In the city, there were no stray dogs to feed, so the grandmother took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of the house. Though he shared a room with his grandmother, the author went to school by bus and studied modern subjects. Thus, the author's grandmother could neither accompany him to school nor help him with his studies. This, coupled with the fact that the school had no religious instruction, made her unhappy. She was also aghast to hear that they taught music at school. In her opinion, music was only for beggars or dancing girls. Later, when the author started going to the university, he was given a separate room in the house. This comprehensively snapped whatever remained of their friendship. The grandmother became more reclusive and spent her entire day sitting by her spinning wheel and reciting prayers. The high point of her day now was the half hour she spent feeding sparrows in the afternoon. The little birds surrounded her, chirping loudly and eating little bits of bread. After his university education, the author went abroad for his higher studies. Contrary to the author's expectation, she remained unemotional and just kissed him on his forehead when she saw him off. Given her age, the author was unsure if he would see her again. But she received him at the station 5 years later. There was no change in her, neither in her looks nor in her behavior. However, on his first evening back home, the author's grandmother broke her routine and celebrated his homecoming. She sang for hours on end with other ladies from the neighborhood. The next morning, she fell ill. While the doctor assured the family that she would be better soon, the old lady declared that those were her last hours. She refused to talk to anyone. and demanded that she be left alone to pray. As she lay in bed, praying inaudibly as always, she passed away. The author's family laid it on the floor, covered it with a cloth, and left to make funeral arrangements. When they returned, a surprising sight met their eyes. Thousands of silent sparrows surrounded the dead body. They took no notice of the breadcrumbs that the author's mother scattered on the floor, and flew away just as quietly as they sat once the body was taken away for the last rites. There are two characters in the story, the author's grandmother and the author himself. Click each label to learn more about the characters. The author draws an interesting portrait of his grandmother, who is the central character of the story. She is presented as old, short, and fat, with a slight stoop and a wrinkled face. She has silver hair and dresses in pristine white clothes. The author asserts that she was inwardly beautiful, even though she did not look pretty. He compares her to the winter landscapes in the mountains, owing to the way she radiated calmness. The author's grandmother comes across as deeply religious. There are several instances in the story that reveal this. She recites prayers as she gets the author ready for school as a child. She also accompanies him to the school because it was attached to a temple. Once they move to the city, she is worried about the lack of religious instruction in her grandson's school. In later years, the author's grandmother seems to shun all speech in favor of prayers. She goes around the house praying quietly and counting the beads of her rosary. Even towards the end, she chooses to lie in bed and pray instead of interacting with her family. The author's grandmother is quite traditional. This is evident in her skepticism towards the subjects taught in her grandson's city school. Also, when she learns that her grandson is being taught music, she practically stops speaking to him. The author's grandmother also comes across as a loving and caring person. She does everything possible to ensure that he gets a good education when he lives with her, and also once they move to the city. When the author becomes a university student, she is at the railway station to see him off and also receive him when he returns. Her love is not restricted just to her grandson. She displays immense affection for animals, which is evident from her feeding dogs and sparrows. So deep is her bond with the sparrows that after she passes away, they turn up to pay their last respects. The author's grandmother seems to be uncomplaining. She does not grumble about the fact that her grandson drifted away from her. In fact, she remains unemotional, even in situations where the author expected her to be upset. She suppresses her inner anguish with silence and prayers and fights her loneliness by feeding sparrows. The author obviously loved and respected his grandmother. His love for her is clear when he speaks of her being beautiful and compares her to an expanse of pure white serenity. He appreciates her for all that she did for him when he was a child. The fact that the author refers to her as a lady in the story's title is also indicative of the respect he has for her. Now let us examine the story closely. The story is set in two locations. The early part of the story takes place in a village. It portrays the initial years of togetherness which the author shares with his grandmother. The setting for the rest of the story is the city, where the strong emotional bond the author shared with his grandmother weakens significantly. The change in setting brings out the change in the relationship between the author and his grandmother more poignantly. The main theme of the story is the evolving nature of relationships. When the author is a child, he is good friends with his grandmother. But as he grows up, they drift apart. This accurately mirrors the relationships we have with our elders. Like the author, as children we are close to our elders, especially our grandparents. However, as we grow up, the closeness fades, not intentionally, but because our interests and concerns become different. The story also touches upon the exclusion and isolation that a large number of elderly people face in their old age, even while living with their families. We are told that the grandmother accepts her seclusion sadly, but uncomplainingly, when the author is given his own room. She tries to fill the void by praying and feeding sparrows. Another theme is the difference in perspective between the traditional and the modern, and between the village and the city. The author's grandmother is a traditional lady from a village, for whom the study of religion and scripture are important components of learning. She gets worried when her grandson starts going to an English school, where there are no religion classes and only modern subjects. Similarly, she is contemptuous of music being taught in schools, as she feels that music is only for the poor and the immoral. The story is written in an autobiographical style, vividly depicting the author's memories as a child and an adult. Written in the first person, this story engages readers and allows them to view the relationship from the perspective of a grandchild.